A werewolf shifter romance written by Katherine Stewart. Prologue. The salt-laced wind, a treacherous liar. Tonight it whispered of scouring gales, of an ocean eager to reclaim the land. Yet the moon, swollen, luminous, hung in a sky cruelly clear. Elara had learned. Never trust such nights. They were the worst kind. She'd been in this particular fishing hamlet, nestled precariously between a dense ancient forest and a shingle beach, for 3 lunar cycles. Too long. The rhythm of the tides. It had begun to feel less like a comfort, more like the bars of a cage closing in. Her meager savings, earned mending nets with calloused fingers that still remembered the give of things they shouldn't, were nearly gone. Time to move. But the moon, it had outpaced her resolve. The first thrum, deep in her marrow. An old familiar vibration her human mind screamed against, even as her body began to betray her. She was in her rented room, damp, cold, above a boisterous tavern. The scent of stale beer, of fried fish, a constant assault. Her senses, sharpening, beyond endurance. Panic, cold, sharp, clawing at her throat. It was too soon, hours too soon by her desperate, meticulous calculations. Not here. God's not here. Escape survival, get to the forest, to the concealing darkness, before the change took her fully, before the sounds began. Her overall goal, as always, remain unseen, unknown, a ghost, in her own life, her limbs, already stiffening, the air in the small room, suddenly thick, suffocating, each breath, a ragged tear in her lungs. She could smell it, the fear sweat blooming on her own skin, a coppery tang, mingling with the distant, irresistible pull of the moon-slicked sea. Her internal state, a raging tempest, terror, and a bone-deep weariness. Why can't it just end? The human part of her whimpered, even as the other part, that ancient surging power, clawed its way to the surface. A shout from the tavern below, a burst of drunken laughter, like a physical blow. Too close. They were too close. Her reaction, explosive. She didn't bother with the door. With a surge of preternatural strength, a strength already warping her frame, she threw herself at the flimsy window. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The fall to the muddy alley below, a jarring agony. But her bones, they were already shifting, becoming something other, something hideously resilient. Rain, sharp, cold, began to lash down. The earlier clear sky, a forgotten mockery. The forest edge, 100 desperate paces away. Each step, a battle. Her skeleton cracked, reformed, fur, thick, dark, matted like wet kelp, erupting across her skin. The sounds, ripped from her throat, no longer human. She reached the dripping, tangled embrace of the ancient woods just as the last vestiges of Elara's consciousness fractured. The world exploded, a chaos of scent and sound, the earthy rot of decaying leaves, the terrified scurrying of small creatures, the distant maddening roar of the king tide, drawn by that engorged moon. Her vision sharpened, colors leached away, replaced by a world of stark, moon-bleached contrasts, of deep, fathomless shadows. Her own scent, wild, musky, filled her new, elongated snout. For hours, she was only the wolf, the SeaWolf. As the almost forgotten parts of her ancestral lore whispered, she ran, not with joy, but with a desperate, hunted urgency. The rain plastered her strange, oceanic fur to her powerful limbs. No memory of a pact with a jealous sea deity. No understanding of an ancestor's transgression. Only the raw, untamed power, and the gnawing emptiness where her human thoughts had been. The turning point of the night, distant men's voices, the flicker of lanterns through the trees. Hunters, or just late-night revelers from the tavern, their curiosity piqued by the shattering glass. The wolf didn't analyze. It reacted, fled deeper. Its bioluminescent eyes, a terrifying trait she knew the wolf possessed but could never see herself, cutting through the undergrowth. As dawn approached, gray, unforgiving, the change reversed itself. A slow, agonizing unraveling, leaving her naked, bruised, shivering in a hollow beneath the roots of a fallen oak, the borrowed piece of the wolf, gone, replaced by the familiar crushing weight of human despair. Her memories of the night? Fractured. Mercifully so. But the physical evidence of her transformation, the mud, the blood from a gash on her leg where she'd scraped against rock, the lingering scent of wet fur and wildness on her skin, undeniable. She curled into herself. The cold seeped into her bones, but it was the chill within her soul that was truly unbearable. Can I, Elara, ever be truly loved and accepted for all that I am, beast and woman? Or am I destined for eternal isolation and self-loss? The question echoed, in the hollow of her heart, already answered by the desolate dawn. Each town, the same. Each escape left her more broken.
The salt on the wind, a sharp slap, a familiar greeting Elara had learned never to trust. It tasted of old iron, of deeper, colder things. This new village, Clam-Haven by the faded signpost, clung to the jagged coastline like a stubborn barnacle. Huddled, between a dark, brooding forest and a beach that looked like shattered teeth. She'd seen a dozen like it. Maybe more. They blurred together, a tapestry of damp wood, fish guts, and the ever-present hungry roar of the sea. Another temporary stop, she thought. Her breath misted in the chill May air. This time, she'd give it 3 moons, no more, because that was all the dwindling coins in her thin purse would allow. And then, she found a room, small, tucked above a noisy tavern. It reeked of stale beer and fried things, the kind of smell that stuck to your clothes, your hair. The floorboards groaned with every step, like an old man complaining. She meticulously checked the single window. Flimsy latch, easy to break, if needed. Her senses, always a little too sharp, a little too awake, picked up everything. The clink of glasses downstairs, a dog barking 2 streets over, the distant, mournful cry of a curlew. Not only that, but the rhythmic crash of the waves. It felt different here, heavier, like it was trying to tell her something. Moments later, as she unpacked her meager belongings, a change of clothes, a worn blanket, and a small oilskin-wrapped bundle of herbs and faded parchments, a wave of dizziness hit her. Her hand flew to her temple. A flicker, just a tiny skip in time, like a dropped stitch in the day. Already? The fear, cold, immediate. It tightened its grip. Deep down, she knew the truth. This place, like all the others, offered no real peace, only a borrowed moment, before the old terror returned. She needed to be careful, so very careful. The loneliness, heavy as a wet cloak, settled around her. Maybe it was fate that brought her to these lonely edges of the world, but it was a cruel one. Still, she needed to survive. Come morning, Elara moved through Clam-Haven like a shadow. Her worn boots made little sound on the cobbled paths. The village was small. Most of its life centered around the rickety pier where fishing boats bobbed like tired toys. Men with faces weathered like driftwood glanced at her, their eyes curious, some suspicious. Women, mending nets or gutting fish, offered brief, assessing stares. She kept her gaze down, her hood pulled low, trying to appear unremarkable, forgettable. Her heightened senses caught the undertones of their lives, the tang of worry clinging to the scent of fish, the low murmur of dwindling catches, the faint, metallic scent of sickness from a shuttered cottage. Because of that, a strange, unwanted empathy pricked at her. Their struggles, they felt familiar. She saw him then, alone. On a small, weathered boat, the Sea Sprite, its faded name, mending a vibrant blue net. It seemed too bright for the muted tones of the harbor. There was a stillness about him, a quiet strength. It drew her eye, despite herself. His dark hair was ruffled by the wind, and even from a distance, she could feel a profound sadness clinging to him, palpable, like the salt in the air. He didn't look up, his attention entirely on his work. As if pulled by a string, her gaze lingered, longer than it should have. Just another man, she told herself, another person to avoid. Yet, there was something in the way he moved, a careful, almost reverent touch on the worn net that made her pause. Before she could move, an older fisherman with a face like a creased map called out to her from a nearby stall piled high with ropes and rusted hooks. "Looking for work, girl?" His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Can always use a hand with the mending, if you've the skill, and don't mind the pay." This was it. A chance. A dangerous chance. But her purse, almost empty. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. What choice did she have? The storm had been brewing all afternoon, a subtle shift in the air. Only she, perhaps, had truly registered it. The wind, once just a playful tease, now carried a sharper, more urgent edge. The sky, a bruised purple, pressed down on the village. Meanwhile, the tide, usually a predictable friend, had pulled back with an almost violent greed, exposing a vast, treacherous stretch of seabed, littered with jagged black rocks and slick, tangled kelp, a landscape usually hidden beneath the waves. Elara felt the change deep in her bones, a restless, agitating hum that always accompanied such raw displays of nature's power. It was a siren song to the otherness within her. Despite that, she found herself drawn to the exposed wildness, her boots sinking slightly in the sucking mud, as she ventured further than any sane villager would dare. And then, she saw him, Finn, the man from the sea sprite. He wasn't in his boat. He was out there, on those dangerous flats, wrestling with something huge, dark, caught amongst the rocks. It was a section of an old, forgotten iron mooring chain, thick as a man's arm, dislodged by the fierce tidal pull, and it had snagged his beautiful blue net, the one she'd seen him mending with such care. He was heaving, his face a mask of grim effort, putting himself at real risk as the tide, she could feel it, was already beginning to turn, the incoming waves starting to hiss around the furthest rocks. Without thinking, her body moved. Maybe it was the raw sight of his struggle against the indifferent power of the sea, a struggle she knew all too well. Or maybe it was just the unexpected, foolish pulse of something else. She didn't call out. Instead, she navigated the slick, treacherous rocks with an unnerving, swift grace, her movements more animal than human. She reached him just as his boot slipped on a patch of slime-covered stone, his hand scraping hard against a barnacle-encrusted outcrop. He cursed, a low, bitten-off sound. Before either could speak, Elara pointed, her finger unerring, towards a less obvious but critical leverage point where the massive chain was wedged, a detail only someone with an intimate, almost instinctive feel for such tangled dangers might spot. Then, bracing herself in a way that hinted at a surprising, wiry strength, she moved to help him take the strain. Her presence an unexpected, silent anchor in the rising wind. Together, in a few breathless, strained moments of shared effort, the groan of tortured metal loud against the rising shriek of the wind and the hungry growl of the returning sea, they freed the net. Finn, breathing heavily, finally straightened and looked at her properly. His eyes, the color of the deep sea before a storm, dark and unsettlingly perceptive, taking her in. Rain, cold, sharp, began to spit from the bruised sky, plastering her hair to her face. He saw a woman, pale, but resolute, her own eyes reflecting the wildness of the brewing tempest. She didn't offer a smile, just a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Already starting to turn away, the familiar urge to flee, to erase herself, surging through her. regret at her impulsiveness, a bitter taste. I wouldn't have seen that, Finn managed, his voice rough, gesturing to the leverage point. That chain. It's been there for years. Thought I knew every hazard on this flat. He paused, his gaze unwavering, a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, suspicion, in their depths. And then, more quietly, he added, You move like you belong out here, in the ugly weather. Elara didn't answer. Without another word, she continued her retreat towards the shore, leaving him with his salvaged net, the encroaching tide, and the sudden sharp imprint of her strange, timely appearance, an equally swift departure. The wildness of her, the way she seemed to understand the treacherous edge of the ocean, it lingered in his mind. Long after she was gone, a disquieting, intriguing puzzle, the memory of his words, You move like you belong out here in the ugly weather, it echoed in Elara's mind. Long after she'd fled the shoreline. Truth be told, she didn't know what scared her more, his perception, or her own reckless impulse to help him. She spent the rest of that day and a fitful, storm-tossed night barricaded in her small room above the tavern, the scent of the sea, and something indefinably Finn, clinging to her senses. Her immediate goal? Scrub that encounter from her mind, reinforce the walls around her heart. But then, just as the weak morning sun tried to peek through the grime on her window, a polite, hesitant knock sounded on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one knew she was here. Without warning, her body tensed. Every instinct screamed, Danger! She didn't make a sound. Maybe they'd go away. The knock came again, a little firmer this time. Miss Elara? His voice, Finn's, low, and with that same quiet timbre she remembered from the beach, like the deep, steady rumble of distant waves. How did he know her name? Had she even told him? Panic, cold, sharp, pricked at her skin. In that moment, her only thought was flight. She glanced at the window. A dangerous jump, yes, but she'd done it before. Still, something in his tone, a gentleness that didn't quite match the rough-hewn look of him, made her hesitate. What did he want? Her motivation was to understand the immediate threat, or what? Could it be something else? Moments later, after a stretched silence where Elara barely breathed, she found herself cracking the door open. Just a sliver, her body poised to slam it shut, to run. Finn stood there, holding a small, clumsily wrapped bundle of what looked like dried fish. He wasn't scowling like the day before. Instead, his expression, uncertain. Those sea storm eyes held a hint of apology, maybe? I figured you might be, well, after yesterday? He gestured vaguely. And I asked Old Man Hemlock at the stalls. He mentioned a new woman, good with nets. Said your name was Elara. His voice was surprisingly soft, not demanding at all. He wasn't pushing, just offering. The fish smelled fresh, clean. A peace offering? Her internal state, a whirlwind, suspicion, and a strange, unfamiliar flutter of something that might have been warmth? Thank you, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She took the fish, their fingers brushing, for the briefest second. A jolt, like static electricity. It shot up her arm, as if pulled by a string, her gaze met his, and the air, it thickened. He didn't push for more, just gave a small nod. The sea provides, he said simply, sometimes. And then, he was gone. His retreating footsteps surprisingly light on the creaky landing. Elara closed the door, her back pressed against it. The scent of him, salt, wind, and something uniquely deeply Finn, lingering in the small space. This encounter, this small kindness. A dangerous crack in her carefully constructed defenses. Her core question echoed. Could this man, with his quiet eyes and unexpected gentleness, ever understand the storm raging within her? The thought itself, a betrayal of every survival instinct she possessed. What followed was a week of agonizing internal conflict. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't shake the image of Finn, his quiet persistence, the unexpected warmth of his simple gesture, her plan to flee Clam-Haven at the first opportunity. It felt complicated now. To make things worse, her curse felt more agitated. The approaching new moon casting long, ominous shadows over her already frayed nerves. She found herself poring over the faded parchments her grandmother had pressed into her hands years ago, the ones filled with cryptic warnings, fragmented lore about their SeaWolf lineage. The beast thrives in the lonely dark, one passage read, its spidery script barely legible. Isolation starves the soul, and a starved soul feeds the endless hunger. What did that even mean? Was it possible that her constant running, her deliberate severing of all ties, was actually making things worse? She didn't know what scared her more, the escalating intensity of her transformations, or the terrifying whisper of hope Finn's presence had ignited. Meanwhile, she saw him, from a distance, of course, mending his nets on the pier, his movements economical, sure, or heading out in the sea sprite before dawn, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent canvas of the ocean. Each glimpse, a fresh torment. Because of that, the village, once just another anonymous hiding place, started to feel smaller, more claustrophobic. She experienced another memory lapse, sharper this time. She was mending a torn sail for Old Man Hemlock, her fingers moving with practiced skill, and then, for a full minute, she couldn't recall where she was, or how she'd learned the intricate stitch. Panic. Stark. Absolute. It had seized her. That's why the words from the parchment echoed, with such chilling resonance. Was she losing herself? Piece by piece? To the lonely dark? The decision point. It came unexpectedly, as they often do. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple into the restless sea, Elara found herself walking along the cliff path, a wild, untamed place she usually sought for its solitude. The wind whipped her hair across her face, carrying the scent of brine and damp earth. And then she saw him, Finn, sitting on a weathered outcrop of rock, staring out at the churning water. His shoulders slumped, an air of profound desolation clinging to him. He hadn't seen her. Her body moved on instinct, a foolish, reckless urge to... What? Offer comfort? She, who had none to give? She should turn, run, disappear. That was the Elara way. But then, she remembered the kindness in his eyes, the shared struggle on the beach, the unsettling words from her grandmother's lore. Isolation starves the soul. In the span of a breath, she made a choice, a small choice, a terrifying choice. Instead of fleeing, she took a single, hesitant step towards him. This was it, her point of no return, for this stage of her unwilling journey. She was choosing, however small, a potential connection, over the familiar, suffocating safety of her solitude. The air crackled with unspoken things as she approached, the sound of the waves below, like the frantic beating of her own heart.
The wind tugged at Elara's hair, whipping strands across her face as she took that small, terrifying step towards Finn. He still hadn't noticed her, just kept staring out at the restless gray-green sea, a mirror to the turmoil she felt churning inside him, a sorrow so deep, it seemed to pull the fading sunlight into its depths. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird, trapped. Turn around, the old, familiar voice of fear whispered. He'll see the cracks in you. He'll see the monster you hide. But then, she remembered the kindness in his eyes when he'd brought her the fish, the way he'd simply nodded, no questions asked. Maybe it was fate, or maybe just her own desperate loneliness. But her feet kept moving. One slow step, after another, over the uneven moss-slicked stones of the cliff path. As if summoned by her silent approach, Finn finally turned. His eyes, the color of a turbulent ocean, widened slightly. In surprise. He hadn't expected anyone, especially not her, the quiet, almost invisible woman from the village. "Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble, easily mistaken for the distant break of waves. There was no suspicion in it, just acknowledgement, and then a faint frown creased his brow. "It's a rough evening to be out here. The wind's picking up." Elara stopped a few feet away, her hands tucked into the worn sleeves of her thin woolen shawl. "It is," she agreed, her voice softer than she intended, almost stolen by the wind. She wanted to say more, to explain her presence, but the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say? "I felt your sadness, and it called to me." Deep down, she knew the truth. She was playing with a fire that could consume her. Her motivation was a confusing mix, a desire to offer some unspoken comfort, perhaps, but also a selfish need to feel just for a moment like a normal person, sharing a sunset with another soul. "The sea, it looks angry tonight," she offered instead. A safe, impersonal observation. Finn's gaze drifted back to the horizon where the sky bled into the churning water. "She often is," he murmured, a lifetime of experience in those few words. "My father used to say she keeps all her tempers close to the surface, but her deepest heart is still." He paused, a shadow passing over his features. "I haven't found that stillness in a long time." In that moment, Elara felt a pang of connection so sharp it almost made her gasp. His loneliness. It called to hers. Because of that, she found herself saying, Sometimes the storms are what make you feel most alive, even if they're terrifying." It was a dangerous admission, a glimpse into her own turbulent soul. He looked at her then, truly looked, a new kind of interest dawning in his eyes, a curiosity that made her skin tingle, with both fear and a strange, unfamiliar anticipation. The space between them burned, with unspoken questions. This fragile, tentative sharing of a stormy evening. Elara learning to exist in proximity to another. A dangerous, exhilarating new skill. The full moon, only a week away. A silent predator stalking the edges of her calendar. And this new, reckless feeling inside her. Was it hope? Or just another path? To ruin. From there, an unspoken understanding. It began to weave itself between Elara and Finn. They didn't speak much in the days that followed their clifftop encounter. More a series of quiet acknowledgments, shared glances across the busy pier, or a nod as he headed out on the Sea Sprite while she delivered mended nets to Old Man Hemlock. Finn found himself looking for her. A fleeting glimpse of her dark hair caught by the wind. The way she moved with that strange, watchful grace. He didn't know what scared him more about the pull he felt towards her, her almost ethereal quietness, or the deep, unspoken sorrow he sensed within her. A sorrow that mirrored his own. He wanted to know her story. What had brought such a cautious, almost hunted look to her eyes? Yet he held back, sensing that pushing her would only make her retreat further into whatever shadows she inhabited. His goal was simply to let her know, in small ways, that he saw her, that she wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, for Elara, each small interaction, a tightrope walk, the growing ease around Finn, a dangerous balm, her primal instincts, usually on high alert, sometimes softened in his presence. A low hum of something that wasn't fear, but almost recognition. What's worse, it made the deceptions harder. One blustery afternoon, while she was helping Finn secure loose tarpaulins on his boat before a predicted squall, he asked casually, "You always this good with knots, Elara?" You tie them like someone who spent a lifetime at sea, not just a few weeks mending in the village. Her heart leaped, a simple question, innocently asked. But then her mind raced. The intricate knots she knew. They weren't from mending, they were from securing herself, from desperate, half-remembered measures taken during the fog of her transformations. My grandfather was a fisherman, she lied, the word feeling like ash in her mouth. He taught me a few things. The lie came easily, too easily, and the guilt. A cold stone in her stomach. Because of that, she pulled away, muttering an excuse about needing to get back. This was the price of her secrecy, these small, constant betrayals of an honesty she craved. Later that night, she pored over her grandmother's parchments again, her fingers tracing the spidery script. The SeaWolf walks a lonely path, for its truth is a tide that can drown the unwary. Yet, even the deepest ocean yearns for the light. The words offered no comfort, only more riddles. One of the parchments, more brittle than the others, depicted a crude drawing of a wolf-like creature with what looked like glowing eyes, standing on a moonlit shore, a human figure kneeling before it. What did it mean? Was it a warning or something else entirely? Finn watched Elara hurry away that afternoon, a frown creasing his forehead, her sudden withdrawal, the almost panicked look in her eyes before she'd veiled it. It didn't make sense. She was like a sandpiper, he thought, skittish, ready to take flight at the slightest disturbance. Still, there was a strength to her, a resilience. It intrigued him deeply. He'd seen it that day on the tidal flats, the way she'd faced the storm and the danger without flinching, and her knowledge of knots. Uncanny. Not just good, but expert, with a surety that spoke of long, hard-won experience. His father had tied knots like that. As the silence stretched after her departure, Finn found himself wondering about the shadows under her eyes, the way she always seemed to be listening, for something just beyond his own hearing. Old Man Hemlock had mentioned she was a hard worker. Quiet, kept to herself, said she'd come from down coast, but no one knew much more. Maybe it was fate that had washed her up in Clam-Haven, a place that specialized in lost things and forgotten people. He found himself wanting to protect her, though from what he couldn't say. Himself, perhaps, or the sadness that seemed to cling to her like the ocean mist. He wasn't sure he was capable of protecting anyone, not anymore, not after failing his own father. The thought was a familiar ache, a cold tide, pulling him under. That night, the predicted squall hit Clam-Haven with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain lashed against Finn's cottage windows. The wind screamed like a banshee through the eaves. He lay awake, listening. The storm outside a pale echo of the one that often raged within him. His thoughts, inevitably, drifted to Elara. Where did she shelter? Was her small room above the tavern holding against this onslaught? He imagined her alone, perhaps frightened. And then, a different sound cut through the wind's howl, a strange, mournful cry, almost like an animal in pain, yet with a quality that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It seemed to come from the direction of the cliffs, or perhaps the deep woods bordering the sea. Without thinking, he was out of bed, pulling on his boots and oilskins. Madness, to go out in this. But the sound, it had been too desperate, too raw. As if pulled by a string, he found himself heading towards the forest path, his lantern casting a weak, flickering beam against the storm's violent canvas. What was he doing? Was this how his father had felt? Drawn out into the teeth of his final storm, by some irresistible, fatal call? The cry came again, closer this time, and a shiver, that had nothing to do with the cold, traced its way down his spine, the cry that had pulled Finn from his bed. It was swallowed by the storm's next roaring breath. He stumbled along the muddy, root-choked forest path, his lantern swinging wildly, casting grotesque dancing shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. Rain, driven by a wind that seemed to have teeth, clawed at his face. Every instinct, honed by years at sea, screamed at him, turn back, find shelter. Yet that sound, it had been too full of pain, too laced with a desolation that echoed his own deepest grief. He didn't know what scared him more, the thought of what creature could make such a noise, or the possibility that it was Elara, lost, terrified, in this raging blackness. He pushed deeper into the woods, the ancient trees groaning above him, like tormented giants. Then, he saw it. A flicker of movement near the cliff edge, a darker shape against the dark, thrashing foliage. Not human, definitely not human, too large, too fluid. His heart hammered. Was this the source of the cry? Meanwhile, Elara, in her SeaWolf form, was barely clinging to consciousness. The violent squall, so sudden, so fierce, had caught her unprepared. Her control snapping like a dry twig, the transformation brutal, accelerated by the atmospheric turmoil, and her own rising emotional distress over Finn. She'd fled her small room, instinct driving her towards the wildness of the cliffs, away from the village. But then, pain, sharp, searing, it ripped through her hind leg as she'd scrambled over a loose scree of rocks in the blinding rain. Now, she lay half-concealed in a shallow crevice, the wind and rain lashing her thick kelp-like fur, her injured leg throbbing with an agonizing beat. She could smell blood, her own, and something else. Unfamiliar, man scent, close, fear, primal, overwhelming. It surged through her. As her wolf stirred, a low growl, more a whimper of pain and terror, rumbled in her chest. That was the sound Finn had heard. Finn froze. The shape moved again, and, in that moment, a sliver of moonlight broke through the storm clouds, briefly illuminating a massive wolf-like creature, with fur as dark as a stormy sea. Its eyes, they seemed to glow, with a faint, eerie luminescence, like foxfire. His breath caught. He'd heard tales, old fishermen's yarns, about spirits of the deep woods and vengeful sea creatures, stories his father had dismissed with a laugh. But this was no story. This was real. And it was wounded. He could see the unnatural angle of its hind leg, the dark stain spreading on the rocks beneath it. Deep down, he knew the truth, or at least a horrifying part of it. This was no ordinary animal. And that cry, it had been pure agony. Despite that, his fear was a living thing, coiling in his gut. This creature, immense, powerful, its very presence thrumming with an untamed energy that vibrated in the air. He took a hesitant step back. He should run. He should get help. But what help? Who would believe him? And what if it was already too late? The scent of the man, Finn, pierced through Elara's pain-filled haze. Panic, sharp, undiluted. It clawed at her. He can't see me like this. He can't know. Her instinct, to drag herself away, to disappear, to protect her secret at all costs. But then, another wave of agony from her leg made her cry out again, a choked, desperate sound. She saw his silhouette, the wavering light of his lantern. He was so close. He'll see the monster. The thought, a shard of ice in her fading human consciousness. Her motivation even now was to protect him. From herself. From this truth she believed would destroy any kindness he'd shown her. So, with a monumental effort of will, fighting against the primal instincts of the wolf that urged her to either attack or flee, she forced herself to go still, trying to blend into the shadows, praying he wouldn't come closer, praying the storm would swallow her whole. Between one breath and the next, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds, the raging storm, and the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart. Could this night get any worse? She feared. it was only just beginning. Come morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised, weeping sky and a landscape scoured clean. Finn hadn't approached the creature further that night. The sheer primal terror, the instinct for self-preservation, had eventually driven him back to his cottage, his mind reeling, his heart pounding with a fear unlike any he'd known. He hadn't slept. The image of those glowing eyes burned into his memory. Yet as dawn broke, a different feeling began to surface, a nagging worry, a strange sense of responsibility. He told himself it was madness. It was a wild animal, dangerous. But then he remembered the sound of its pain, and he remembered Elara, her own haunted eyes, her skittish ways, her uncanny connection to the wilder aspects of the coast. An unsettling thought, impossible, terrifying, began to take root in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, the connection lingered. Could it be? No. Impossible. Still, he found himself walking back towards that stretch of cliff and forest, his steps heavy with a dread he couldn't name. The spot where he'd seen the creature, empty, save for a few disturbed rocks, and a faint musky scent almost washed away by the rain. But there was something else. A small torn piece of dark blue wool, snagged on a thorny bush, the exact color of the shawl Elara always wore. His world tilted. Elara had dragged herself back to her room before the first light. The transformation back to her human form, an agonizing, protracted ordeal. It left her weak, shivering, and on the verge of collapse. Her leg, a mess of torn flesh and deep bruises. Truth be told, she didn't know how she'd made it. The fear of Finn having seen her, truly seen her, was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She had to leave. Today, now, this place, no longer safe. No place ever was, for long. As she lay there, feverish and trembling, her grandmother's parchments seemed to mock her from the small table. She'd been a fool to hope, a fool to allow even the smallest connection. And then, her gaze fell upon that one cryptic passage again, the one she'd almost dismissed. The SeaWolf is not healed by solitude, but by the anchor of a knowing soul. When the beast is acknowledged, not shunned, the tide of forgetting may be stayed. A knowing soul? Acknowledged? What did it mean? For so long her only goal had been to hide, to suppress, to run. In that moment, a new, terrifying thought bloomed. What if her entire approach to the curse, her lifelong strategy of isolation, was not just failing, but actively harming her, accelerating the very loss of self she so desperately feared? This was the midpoint shift, a devastating, world-altering possibility. Something inside her shifted. Could it be that connection, the very thing she feared most, was not the path to destruction, but to salvation, or at least a fragile kind of survival? The king tide, the moon of ultimate reckoning according to the lore, only 3 days away. What followed was Elara, feverish and in pain, her mind a whirlwind, the revelation from the parchment, a terrifying earthquake, shaking the foundations of her entire existence. Deep down she knew the truth. She couldn't run anymore. Not just from Finn, but from the possibility, however faint, that the lore held a different answer. Because of that, her desperation took on a new edge. Not just fear now, it was a frantic, racing hope. Wilder, more dangerous than any storm. Meanwhile, Finn, his mind grappling with the impossible implications of that scrap of blue wool, felt a growing unease settle over Clam-Haven. He saw Elara later that day, limping slightly, her face pale, drawn. When their eyes met across the pier, he saw not just her usual guardedness, but something else. A raw, almost pleading intensity. It made his chest ache. Her voice trembled when she spoke a brief greeting, her scent carrying a faint trace of blood and damp earth he tried not to recognize. That night, Elara, her leg throbbing, her resolve a fragile new thing, made a decision. The king tide was coming. The lore spoke of a ritual, an offering, an acknowledgement under that specific moon. She had to try. She had to find out if this terrifying path of vulnerability held any truth. As the sky darkened, she knew she couldn't do it alone. If the legend was right, she needed Finn. But how could she ask? How could she reveal a truth so monstrous? She felt it, clear as day. That time was running out. Not just for her memory, but for any chance of a life that wasn't defined by shadows. The stakes were no longer just about her secret, but about her very soul.
The decision, once made, settled in Elara's chest like a cold, heavy stone, yet also like a fragile, fluttering bird. Truth be told, she didn't know if it was courage or utter madness that now propelled her. The king tide, only 2 nights away. 2 more sunsets. Before the moon, her constant tormentor and silent confidant would demand its ultimate due. Her injured leg still ached with a dull, persistent throb, a constant reminder of her near-disastrous encounter in the storm, and perhaps of Finn's unsettling proximity to her secret. She had to know. If the tattered lore her grandmother had left her held any truth, or if it was just the desperate scrawling of another doomed soul. Was connection truly an anchor? Or just another way to drown? Her motivation was no longer just survival. It was a desperate gamble for her very soul, for the flickering remnants of Elara, before the wolf consumed all. That night, she found Finn on the pier, mending his blue net under the weak glow of a single lantern. The air was still, the ocean a dark, breathing expanse beneath a sky thick with stars. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light. But his sea-storm eyes, they seemed to see more than she was comfortable with. "Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Late for you to be out." I need to talk to you, Finn," she began, her own voice a shaky whisper. No matter how hard she tried to project calm, a tremor ran through her. Her goal, to test the waters, to see if there was any space in his world for something monstrous. "Have you ever heard tales of things that aren't quite normal? Things that live in the shadows or change with the moon?" She watched his face, her heightened senses straining to decipher every flicker of muscle, every shift in his scent. Finn paused in his mending, his hands, usually so sure, becoming still. As the silence stretched, Elara felt her courage waver. He looked out at the dark water for a long moment before speaking, his voice thoughtful. "My grandmother. She used to tell stories, old stories, from her own grandmother, of people who walked with the spirits of the sea, or carried the wildness of the deep forest inside them." He turned back to Elara, his gaze direct. "She said such beings weren't always monsters, Elara, just different. And that sometimes the world was too quick to fear what it didn't understand." His words, were they a lifeline, or just a general musing? Elara's breath caught. Did he suspect something? Or was this simply the wisdom of a man who lived close to the old ways, the old whispers of the land and sea? She didn't know what scared her more, his potential understanding, or her own rising desperate hope. This interaction, this subtle testing, only solidified her resolve. She had to prepare for the king tide. She had to know if the lore about a knowing soul was her only chance. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavy, absolute. The following day, Elara felt the curse thrumming beneath her skin, with a new vicious intensity. The air itself felt charged. The scent of the nearing king tide, a raw, briny, almost metallic tang, making her teeth ache. What's worse, she knew the moon, even hidden by the daylight, was waxing, growing fat, potent. Her focus was on the ritual items mentioned in her grandmother's lore, specific types of seaweed that only grew in the deepest, most dangerous crevices of the sea caves, smooth gray stones gathered at the precise turn of the tide, and a sprig of wolfsbane, not as a ward, but as an offering. The symbolism was lost on her, but the instructions were clear. She spent the morning in a feverish state, her injured leg protesting, gathering what she could, her senses screaming, with a mixture of primal fear and a strange, almost exhilarating terror. Then it happened. Without warning, as she was hidden deep within a dripping sea cave, the damp walls echoing the frantic beat of her own heart, a wave of dizzying nausea and white-hot pain ripped through her. Her vision blurred, the scent of her own blood, sudden, sharp, filled the air. Before she could move, her hands, they were changing. Fur, dark, coarse, sprouted along her knuckles, her nails thickening, elongating, into wicked, curving claws. It wasn't a full transformation, not like the agonizing, bone-breaking shift of the full moon, but it was more. More than just the internal struggle. This was physical, visible, unmistakable, panic, pure, undiluted. It seized her. In that moment, she knew. She couldn't wait for the king tide to force her hand in front of Finn. She had to tell him. She had to give him the choice, before the choice was taken from them both. The terror of what she was becoming, of what she might do if she lost complete control, was a far greater monster than any fear of his rejection. Her internal state, a maelstrom of horror, and a grim, bone-deep resolve. This partial transformation, this horrifying escalation of her curse in year was the final, brutal catalyst. It stripped away her last vestiges of denial. Her path was set. There was no turning back now. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and blood orange, when Elara finally found Finn. The king tide was tonight. The air was electric, the sea a restless, heaving beast. He was on the path leading from the village to his cottage, his silhouette stark against the dramatic sky. Her heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of her chest. With every heartbeat, her terror grew. But so did a strange, fatalistic calm. This was it, the point of no return. As if pulled by a string, she walked towards him, her limp more pronounced now, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "Finn," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her insides were a quivering mess. He stopped, turning to face her. His expression immediately clouded with concern as he took in her disheveled state, the haunted look in her eyes. "Elara, what is it? What's happened?" Her body moved on instinct, driven by a need so profound it overrode even her deepest fears. I need you to come with me, Finn." Her words tumbled out, rushed, but clear. "Tonight, to the old cove, the one beyond Seal Rock. My life might depend on it." She saw the confusion, the worry, warring in his eyes. "You have to trust me. And you'll see something. Something that might make you hate me, or fear me. But I have to show you, before it's too late." Finn stared at her, the wind whipping her dark hair around her pale face, her eyes like wild captured things. He could smell the fear on her, yes, but also that strange, unsettling scent he'd noticed before. Damp earth, salt, and something else. Something primal and wild that he couldn't quite place. Stronger now than ever. He remembered the torn blue wool, the inhuman cry in the storm, her uncanny knowledge of the sea. His thoughts spun. What was she talking about? What could possibly make him hate her? This quiet, sorrowful woman who had somehow found a crack in the wall around his own grieving heart. Deep down, he knew the truth. Or at least, he knew this was more than just a strange request. This was something pivotal, life-altering. He could see the raw terror in her, but also a desperate, fragile plea. As the silence stretched, thick, heavy between them, broken only by the roar of the sea and the cry of a distant gull, he made his decision. "All right, Elara," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. "All right. I'll come with you." Her shoulders sagged with a relief so profound, it was almost painful to watch. And just like that, everything changed. They were committed now, both of them, to a path whose destination was shrouded in terrifying uncertainty. The walk to Seal Rock Cove would be the longest of their lives.
The walk to Seal Rock Cove. It felt like a journey to the gallows. Elara's every step beside Finn was a betrayal of the fear that screamed at her. Run. Hide. Never let him see the abomination you will become. The king tide was already beginning to surge, the ocean's breath a damp, salty growl against the shore. The moon, nearly full, cast an unnervingly bright silver path across the restless water. A path leading straight to her doom. Her motivation now? A grim cocktail, terror, and a desperate, almost suicidal need to follow the faint, treacherous whisper of hope from her grandmother's lore. What if this was it? What if a knowing soul was the only thing that could stop the endless forgetting? Her heart skipped a beat, then another, each one a frantic drum against the silence that stretched between her and Finn. He hadn't spoken much since agreeing to come, his own face a mask of grim apprehension. Did he already suspect? Did he feel the wrongness thrumming beneath her skin? As they reached the secluded cove, a natural amphitheater of dark, jagged rocks where the waves crashed with percussive fury, Elara turned to him, her internal state, a chaotic storm, mirroring the churning sea. "Finn," she began, her voice barely audible above the roar of the surf. "What you are about to see, please, if you feel anything for me, try to remember the woman, not what happens." Her voice trembled. She couldn't meet his eyes. Her goal, to somehow prepare him, to beg for an understanding she didn't dare believe was possible. And then, the first agonizing spasm hit her. A fire raced through her veins, her bones beginning to twist. A scream, sharp, inhuman, ripped from her throat before she could stop it. Without warning, she collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing. Finn watched, his own heart ceasing to beat, or so it felt. In the span of a breath, the Elara he knew, the quiet, sorrowful woman with eyes like the stormy sea, was gone. In her place, under the merciless light of the near full moon, something else was unfolding. Bones cracked, sickening crunches, limbs elongated, twisted, into unnatural shapes. Dark, kelp-like fur sprouted, thick, coarse, across her writhing form. Her face, contorted in an agony he couldn't comprehend, stretched, reformed, into a lupine snout, fangs gleaming wetly, the moment their eyes locked. Hers no longer human, but blazing with a terrifying bioluminescent silver blue, full of primal pain and confusion. Finn stumbled back, a choked sound of pure, unadulterated horror escaping his lips. This was her deepest fear realized, his terror, a visceral, undeniable rejection. Just like that, everything she had risked, everything she had hoped for, shattered into a million pieces. The world narrowed, to the crushing weight of his fear. What followed was a maelstrom of primal sensation for Elara, her human consciousness fracturing, slipping away like sand through her claws. The pain of the transformation, immense, a fire that consumed thought, leaving only instinct and the raw, untamed power of the SeaWolf. She could smell Finn's fear, a sharp, acrid scent. It cut through the salt and brine like a blade to her heart, even the wolf's heart. It was the scent of betrayal, of horror. as her wolf stirred with a new agonizing surge of power, a mournful howl, ancient, full of a desolation that mirrored the raging sea, tore from her new throat. It was a sound of utter heartbreak, of a soul lost to the lonely dark her grandmother had warned of. Truth be told, her human self was fading, the memories of Finn, of their tentative connection already blurring, being washed away by the relentless tide of the curse. He sees the monster, was her last coherent human thought. A whisper of despair. Before the wolf fully claimed her, Finn was frozen, not by the cold wind whipping off the sea, but by a terror so profound it rooted him to the spot. The creature before him, it was the thing from his nightmares, the beast he'd glimpsed in the storm, but now, undeniably, terrifyingly real. Its silver blue eyes, full of an unearthly light, seemed to pierce through him. Accusing, agonizing, his thoughts spun. This was Elara, the quiet woman who mended nets with such gentle hands, the woman whose sad smile had begun to chip away at the ice around his own heart. Impossible, yet the evidence was before him. A monstrous reality. It defied all reason. He remembered the torn blue shawl, her uncanny strength, her intimate knowledge of the sea's moods. Deep down he knew the truth, but his mind recoiled from it. His immediate reaction was purely visceral: fear, revulsion, a primal urge to flee. He saw not Elara, but an abomination, a creature of the raging storm, a danger that needed to be, what? Destroyed? Contained? He didn't know. He only knew the Elara he thought he was beginning to understand was gone, replaced by this thing. The space between them burned, with her monstrous transformation and his horrified silence. Moments later, as the SeaWolf, Elara, let out another pain-filled howl, it stumbled. Its injured hind leg, the one from the previous storm, clearly causing it immense suffering. It looked vulnerable. Despite its terrifying form, the king tide was surging into the cove now, powerful waves crashing against the rocks, sucking, pulling, with lethal force. The creature, disoriented and in agony, slipped on the wet kelp-strewn stones, scrambling, its claws finding little purchase. Before he could move, a particularly large wave slammed into it, dragging it down, its head briefly submerging. Panic, different from his initial terror, lanced through Finn. It was going to drown. This monster, this Elara that was not Elara, was going to be swallowed by the furious sea. Right before his eyes. He didn't know what scared him more, the beast itself, or the sudden horrifying realization that a part of him, a very small, confused part, didn't want it to die. Because of that, his paralysis began to crack. He saw not just the monster, but the pain in its movements, the desperation in its struggles against the relentless, uncaring ocean, an ocean that had already claimed so much from him. His father's face, pale, lost in the storm-tossed waves, flashed before his eyes. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't. But what could he do? This was Elara's lowest point, the curse seemingly victorious, her life literally hanging in the balance, and for Finn, it was a horrifying confrontation, with his own fear, his past grief, and a dawning, terrible responsibility, the hopeful legend Elara had clung to. It felt like a cruel, distant lie. All seemed utterly, irrevocably lost. The roar of the king tide in Seal Rock Cove, a symphony of chaos. Each crashing wave a hammer blow against Finn's already fractured composure. He stood there, soaked, shivering, the image of the SeaWolf, Elara, being dragged down by the churning water, burned into his mind. His initial terror, that primal urge to flee the monstrous, had receded, replaced by a cold, hollowing despair. Lost. She was lost, just like his father, swallowed by the indifferent, raging sea. The thought, a shard of ice in his gut. Because of that, a familiar wave of self-loathing washed over him. He'd stood frozen, Again, he'd let fear win. Again. What's worse, he'd seen the agony in those luminous silver-blue wolf eyes before the wave took her under. An agony that was more than just animal pain. It was Elara's pain. But then, as another massive wave crashed and receded, he saw her, the SeaWolf. It had somehow fought its way back from the undertow, clinging precariously to a low, jagged rock, half submerged, its breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. Its injured leg trailed uselessly in the churning foam. It looked smaller somehow, weaker, defeated. And then he remembered her words spoken with such desperate hope when she'd been studying those old parchments. The SeaWolf is not healed by solitude, but by the anchor of a knowing soul. When the beast is acknowledged, not shunned, the tide of forgetting may be stayed. A knowing soul. Acknowledged, not shunned. His own horrified reaction, his fear. Had he doomed her? Had he been the final weight that dragged her under? In that moment, something inside Finn snapped, not into more fear, but into a raw, ragged fury, at the curse, at the sea, at his own damn cowardice. More importantly, a desperate, almost impossible resolve began to burn through the despair. His motivation wasn't just to save a creature, it was to save Elara, the woman who, despite her strangeness, her secrets, had touched something in him he thought long dead. Elara! His voice was a raw shout against the wind, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. But he didn't care. He had to try. He remembered her terror when she'd brought him here, her plea to remember the woman. So he began to wade into the treacherous, thigh-deep shallows, the icy water shocking his system. His gaze locked on the struggling form of the SeaWolf. His goal was no longer just to observe, or to survive. It was to reach her, to be that anchor she so desperately needed. His internal state, a maelstrom of fear, yes, but also a burgeoning reckless love, and a determination so fierce it felt like a physical force. He'd lost his father to the sea's fury, and his own youthful helplessness. He wouldn't lose Elara the same way, not if he could help it. This was his turning point. As he drew closer, the SeaWolf lifted its great shaggy head, those luminous eyes filled with a mixture of primal fear and exhaustion, fixed on him. A low growl, like the rumble of shifting stones, vibrated from its chest. A warning. Stay away. Finn stopped, the water tugging at his legs. He could smell its wild, musky scent, the coppery tang of its blood, the ozone from the storm, all mingling into a heady, terrifying perfume. He didn't know what scared him more, the fangs that were clearly visible, or the dawning, horrifying understanding of what Elara endured with every rise of the full moon. Elara, he said again, his voice softer this time, but carrying over the din. It's me. It's Finn. He remembered the lore she'd haltingly tried to explain, the bits about acknowledgement, about not shunning. He had no idea if this was right, if it would work, or if he was about to be torn apart. Truth be told, a part of him still screamed, "Run." Instead, he forced himself to take another step. "I see you, Elara," he said, his voice gaining a strange, shaky strength. "I see you, and I'm not afraid." A lie. He was terrified. But he pushed it down. He talked about the fish she'd mended, the blue net, the way she'd known about the storm before anyone else. He spoke of her quiet strength, the sadness in her eyes that he recognized, because he carried his own. He wasn't performing a ritual, he was just talking, pouring out his heart to this magnificent, terrifying creature, hoping the woman trapped inside could hear him. Because of that, he saw a flicker in those otherworldly eyes, a hesitation. The growl softened, just a fraction. Was it his imagination? Or was Elara, the woman, fighting her way back through the raging storm of the beast? Moments later, the SeaWolf made a small whining sound, its head tilting almost questioningly. The tension in its massive shoulders seemed to ease just a little. Finn kept talking, his voice a steady, if trembling thread in the chaos. He spoke of the way her presence had made ClamHaven feel less empty, less like a tomb for his own grief. He spoke of the scrap of blue wool he'd found, the piece that had connected her to the creature in the woods. He didn't accuse, he simply acknowledged. As the silence stretched between his words, broken only by the storm, he saw the creature try to shift on the rock, its injured leg clearly in agony. Without thinking, he reached out a hand, slowly, palm open, a gesture of peace, of offering. "Let me help you, Elara," he whispered, the words almost lost. "You don't have to do this alone." The king tide was at its absolute peak, the waves crashing with a terrifying final intensity. The SeaWolf stared at his outstretched hand, its luminous eyes fixed on his. Between one breath and the next, it let out a long, shuddering sigh, and its massive form seemed to soften, just a little. Hope, fragile, terrifying, it bloomed in Finn's chest. The fight for Elara's soul, for her very self, was reaching its desperate, uncertain climax.
The king tide crashed around Finn, its icy fingers trying to tear him from his precarious footing, but his gaze remained locked on the massive SeaWolf. He held out his hand, a fragile offering against the storm's fury and the beast's untamed power. He didn't know what scared him more, the thought of her attacking, or the thought of her being swept away before he could even try. And then, between one ragged breath and the next, he saw it, a change, the luminous silver-blue inferno in the wolf's eyes. It seemed to soften, just a fraction, a flicker of something other than primal rage or terror. The great shaggy head, still tilted, let out a sound that was less a growl and more a sigh, a long shuddering exhalation that seemed to carry an ocean of pain. Moments later, the enormous body, already weakened by its injury and the relentless battle against the waves, began to tremble violently, not with aggression, but with something else, something that looked like an unraveling. As if fate demanded it, the very air in the cove seemed to thicken, the moonlight intensifying, as if focused by a giant lens. Finn watched, his heart a wild drum against his ribs, as the SeaWolf convulsed, bones. He could hear them, sickening cracks and snaps, but this time they weren't stretching and elongating. They were receding. Fur, dark and matted, seemed to melt away, replaced by pale human skin that steamed in the cold night air. The lupine snout shortened, softened, the fearsome fangs shrinking. It was an agony to watch, a brutal, raw reversal of the horror he'd witnessed earlier. His motivation was singular now, to stay, to witness, to be there. Because of that, he didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the creature before him reshaped itself into the impossible. Her breath caught as human consciousness, sharp, shockingly clear, slammed back into Elara. One moment, she was the wolf, lost in a maelstrom of pain, fear, and Finn's inexplicably steady voice cutting through the roar. And then, she was herself, collapsed on the wet, cold stones of Seal Rock Cove, naked, shivering, her injured leg a throbbing fire. But the most stunning realization, the one that made her gasp and clutch at her chest, was not the pain, not the cold, but the clarity, the memories. They were there. Finn, the storm, her desperate words to him, the reveal, his fear, and then his voice, calling her. He'd stayed, her thoughts spun, he hadn't run. The moment their eyes locked, truly locked, human to human, she saw no disgust in his gaze, no revulsion, only a profound, bone-deep weariness, an almost unbearable tenderness. And was that relief? Tears. Hot, sudden, They streamed down her face, mingling with the salt spray. Finn. His name. A broken whisper on her lips. The core emotional question of her life, the one that had haunted her every waking moment, seemed to tremble on the verge of an answer she'd never dared to hope for. This was the climax, her return, not just to her body, but to herself, to the possibility of connection. Finn was by her side in an instant, his own exhaustion forgotten. He stripped off his heavy oilskin jacket and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the wind's bite. He didn't speak. Couldn't speak. His throat was too thick with emotion. His chest ached with a feeling so intense it almost brought him to his knees. Elara. She was back, truly back. The sight of her, so fragile and human after the terrifying power of the SeaWolf, was overwhelming. He gently, carefully, scooped her into his arms, mindful of her injured leg. She was lighter than he expected, yet carried the weight of a world of suffering. As he carried her away from the cove, away from the receding roar of the king tide, the first pale fingers of dawn were beginning to touch the bruised eastern sky. The storm had broken, both outside and, it seemed, within. What followed was a quiet blur of warmth and gentle care in Finn's small, cluttered cottage. He cleaned and bandaged her leg with surprising deftness, his touch firm but careful on her chilled skin. He built up the fire in the hearth until it blazed. Chasing away the damp and the lingering shadows of the night, he found an old, soft shirt of his for her to wear, its worn cotton smelling faintly of him, of salt and wood smoke, and a clean, honest man scent that was now, incredibly, a comfort. Elara watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, her body aching, her mind still reeling, but a profound sense of safety, something she hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever, began to settle over her. In the quiet that followed his ministrations, they simply looked at each other. No words were needed. His eyes, those deep sea storm eyes, held no judgment, only a weary understanding and a dawning, tender light. Between them, something cracked, not with violence, but with the gentle pressure of shared trauma and unexpected grace. She saw the man who had faced her monster, faced his own fear, and had not run. And in his gaze, she dared to hope she saw a man who might, just might, see her, all of her, and still stay. The core question wasn't fully answered, not yet, but for the first time, the silence wasn't filled with her fear, but with a fragile, tentative possibility. Days later, a new rhythm began to establish itself in Clam-Haven, a quiet melody, played out between the sea, the forest, and the two souls who had weathered a storm that went far beyond wind and waves. Elara's leg healed slowly. More importantly, something inside her was also mending. The next full moon came, and with it, the familiar, terrifying pull. But then, something was different. Finn was there, not in fear, but in quiet solidarity. As she'd haltingly explained the lore about the knowing soul and the anchor, he didn't try to stop the change, didn't try to cure it. He simply stayed. He sat with her through the initial agonizing stages in the seclusion of his cottage, his presence a steady, warm weight in the room. And then, when the wolf emerged, he spoke to it, his voice calm, acknowledging its power, its wildness, but also reminding it of Elara. As a result, the transformation, while still a profound and primal shift, was different, less agonizing, less chaotic. And when she returned to herself, the memories were clearer, the sense of self less fractured. The tide of forgetting had indeed been stayed. She looked at Finn, his face etched with concern, but also a deep, unwavering acceptance. "You stayed," she whispered, tears in her eyes. He simply took her hand. "Always," he said, his voice thick. Her soul answered. This was their new equilibrium, a life woven from an impossible truth and an even more impossible love. The sea still roared, the moon still waxed and waned, but Elara was no longer entirely alone in the face of her wildness. She had her anchor, and in his eyes she finally saw the answer to her lifelong question. She was seen. She was known. Beast and woman. And she was loved. Epilogue. 2 years later. The air in their small cottage, nestled just beyond the reach of the highest tides, where the mangrove roots spidered into the brackish water, always smelled faintly of the rich, dark wood it was built from, of dried herbs Elara kept bundled, and, most wonderfully, of Finn. Come morning, Elara often watched him from their doorway as he readied the sea sprite, now with a brightly painted prow, a flash of kingfisher blue against the anchor gray of the early sea, the cries of the gulls wheeling over the Gulf of Guinea, a familiar song, no longer a lament. Deep down, she knew the truth. This peace, this startling, everyday peace, was real. That afternoon, Elara sat on the narrow veranda, her fingers deftly weaving vibrant green and yellow raffia into a small, sturdy basket. The sun, a warm, benevolent eye in the azure Nigerian sky, dappled through the fronds of the palm trees shading their home. Her injured leg, long healed, leaving only a faint, silvered scar, a reminder not of pain, but of the night everything had changed. She felt it, clear as day, the subtle shift in the air, the faint metallic tang that always preceded the full moon, now only a night away. But then, instead of the old familiar terror, a quiet awareness settled over her. Finn would be with her. He always was. He walked up from the beach then, his bare feet sandy, a string of silvery bonga fish in one hand, his smile easy and warm as the tropical breeze. "Any luck?" she asked, her own voice calm, laced with an affection that still sometimes surprised her with its depth. "A few bonga and a small barracuda. Enough for tonight, and maybe some to trade for Mama Ebere's yams tomorrow," Finn replied, his gaze lingering on her, soft and full of a love that was her constant anchor. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing, a comfortable, familiar contact. In the quiet that followed, he touched the nearly finished basket. "For the market?" Elara nodded. "Old man Adebayo asked for another one. He says my weaving keeps the salt from his fish." A small smile played on her lips. She was no longer a ghost here. She was Elara, the quiet woman who lived with Finn, the fisherman, the woman with clever hands, and watchful, knowing eyes. Later that night, as the full moon, enormous and silver, climbed the star-dusted sky, they walked hand in hand along the beach. The waves whispered secrets to the shore, their phosphorescent edges glowing with an inner light, much like her own wolf eyes once had in the darkness. The transformation would come soon. It always did. Yet, there was no fear. Finn's hand in hers was warm, steady. As if fate demanded it, he squeezed her fingers. "Ready?" he murmured, his voice a gentle rumble. Elara looked up at him, at the love and acceptance that shone so clearly in his sea storm eyes. Her soul answered. "Always," she whispered, and she let it happen, not with terror, but with a strange, wild grace, knowing that when the wolf padded beside him on the moonlit sand, it would be an acknowledged part of her, a creature loved, not shunned. The ancient lore, the desperate scrawlings about a knowing soul, they hadn't been about rituals or offerings, not really. They'd been about this, about him, about a love strong enough to face the storm, and to find the stillness in its heart. Her world had indeed tilted that night in Seal Rock Cove, and just like that, everything had changed, leading her here, to this precious, improbable peace.